Let's be honest with ourselves for a moment. Name me a hero with a more tumultuous comic history than Spider-Man. I'll wait. Okay, if you actually can't think of one, let me know, because I literally cannot think of one. For fans of the webhead, such as myself, it feels like there's a lot of push and pull when it comes to what Marvel wants to do with him. One moment he's just a guy from the block with superpowers, the next minute he's the owner of a major scientific company on par with Stark Industries. Yeah, to be honest, this isn't really a new issue. In fact, I'd say this inconsistency probably starts all the way back in the 90s. And while I was nowhere near alive for the 1990s, I can assure you the latter years of that decade were pretty bad for the series.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
Yeah, it was probably one of the worst times writing-wise for Spider-Man comics. But there was a light at the end of the tunnel. A new age, a new era if you will. And that new era would be helmed by one of the webhead's greatest writers, in my opinion, J. Michael Straczynski. A heavily influential writer in the world of comics, but also on television. I mean, any sci-fi nerd who's done just a little bit of time with the genre cannot deny the influence of his work, Babylon 5. But he was also a massive fan of comics and even wanted to be a comic writer as a kid. I'm not going to tap too much into his past because, wow, to say his childhood was traumatic would be the understatement of the century. This work would eventually lead him to work on the Spider-Man series starting in 2001 and ending in 2007. And to say that some people find his run controversial, well, that's yet another understatement. I'll get into that within the main part of the video itself, but there's definitely a reason for that reputation. I mean, you definitely read the title, and if you know anything about this run, it's definitely a wild ride to say the least. Though I could probably assume that some of you in the audience who are Spider-Man fans are probably asking, why this particular run? Why not J.M. DeMatteis' time of the series, or Roger Stern, Ultimate Spider-Man, or even the original run by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko? Well, it's simple. This was the first Spider-Man series I remember reading. Now, I obviously read single issues here and there, but this wasn't the first I'd actually read all the way through, front to back. You see, like many kids born in the 2000s, my first exposure to Peter and his webbed world was through the Sam Raimi trilogy, which is pretty much the gold standard for superhero filmmaking. Spider-Man was one of the first things I truly remember loving since I was a young kid. I loved the wall crawler so much that, apparently, for years, I wore nothing but my Spider-Man Halloween costume in public whenever I could. I was like 3 years old, if you're wondering, just in case that answers any questions. I had mostly known the character from cartoons, movies, and even video games, but when it came to reading the comics, that was sort of difficult to pull off since monthly comics aren't usually sold outside of comic book stores. Thus, my only way to read these stories was through collected volumes at my public library. And this run, along with Brian Michael Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man and the earlier parts of Dan Slott's run, I don't care what people say, I think Superior Spider-Man was pretty good. These 3 series started my journey into Spider-Man's vast history. But JMS's time, JMS is short for J. Michael Straczynski, well, there was always something about it that captivated me. If anyone ever asked, who's your favorite Spidey writer? I usually default to Straczynski, but sometimes you have to go back to your favorites as an adult and reconsider them. Which led me to spending the last 2 to 3-ish months reading every single JMS Spider-Man book. Well, at least from his main run on the series. I know he's done side stories after the fact, and they're really good, but they're not the target of this video. JMS's time with Spidey was during a very turbulent time for Marvel Comics. They had barely pulled their drowning body out of the river of bankruptcy and now had something to prove. During this time period, a lot of Marvel series were going through a lot of changes or reinterpretations. I've already covered Mark Waid and Mike Wieringo's great time on the Fantastic Four series during this period, but there was also Grant Morrison's New X-Men, Greg Pak's time on the Hulk, New Avengers, oh, and just the entire Ultimate Universe. The original, not the new one. You get what I mean. When you really think about it, it was in stride with what everything else Marvel was doing at the time, getting back to the essence of the characters while also taking bold and new directions. But that also makes me wonder, was my love for this era of Spider-Man all because of my web-covered glasses? Okay, that was meant to be a pun on rose-tinted glasses, but now that just sounds like a euphemism. Can we forget I ever said that? I'll try to forget I ever said that. Anyway, after reading all that, what did I think? Well, come along with me. Relax, maybe get a snack because this will probably be a longer one. And let's talk about J. Michael Straczynski's era on Spider-Man. The last great Spider-Man run. In my opinion, don't yell at me in the comments, it's just rude. Just to preface before we hop into it, this will be structured like my videos on Fantastic Four and Booster Gold, which you should watch because they're very good in my opinion. Essentially, I'll break down the book into separate arcs, or at least what I can identify as separate arcs. That way, I could speak on the nitty-gritty details, but also split it up so it won't be hell to watch for you guys at home. Now that I've got you up to speed, let's start from the top. This is the arc that starts us off, and what I like to call the Great Reset. Basically laying down the groundwork for whatever JMS is planning to do, while also dropping us back into the story in a very approachable way. This isn't a feature unique to this run though, it happens all the time within superhero comics. These 5 issues start out with a much more grounded and slice-of-life feeling to them. We see Peter in a new point in his life, though Mary Jane isn't seen. Well, that's because of stuff that happened with the last writer, which JMS now has to consider when starting his new story. But I love how the first issue in this arc starts. We just see Peter existing in the streets, wandering in his old neighborhood, reminiscing on where he's been and where he's going. I gotta say here, this is where we're also introduced to John Romita Jr.'s art, and man, it is some of the best comic art for Spider-Man, period. Honestly, if you looked at how Romita Jr. draws Spider-Man and said it was bad, either you don't know much about Western superhero comic art, or you're just a hater. The way he makes everyone so expressive is just perfect. He has this more animated, exaggerated style, but there's elements to the way he draws that makes it feel refined and grounded. Plus, he has the perfect eye for poses and dynamic action. I'd say he's one of the few artists who truly use Spidey's powers to add to their artistic choices rather than just sticking to the traditional looks that have been provided by Todd McFarlane, Steve Ditko, and John Romita Sr. Much like JMS's writing decisions, he's going for a new yet good direction. JMS in his early arc hits the ground running by introducing us to a whole lot of changes. In the first issue alone, we're introduced to Ezekiel Sims, a character who is going to shake our very understanding of what Spider-Man is. For one thing, he also has Spider-Man powers. Now this matters because he was introduced like a whole decade before Spider-Verse or really any other character you could say had a power set like Spidey's. Not only that, but he introduces the idea to Peter that there might be some mystical or mythological origins to their powers. There also comes Morlun, who, over time, has turned into a controversial character, mostly for the writing choices of future stories, but we'll touch on this when we get to it. During this arc, Peter gets a new job. In my opinion, this is one of the best changes done here. Instead of having Peter work at a lab or work under the Daily Bugle, he's now a high school teacher. This is the perfect job for the character. For one, he's always trying to help on a street/community level. He literally calls himself the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. This choice really just writes itself. On top of that, Peter has always been gifted with his ability to learn higher level sciences and math, so putting him into a school setting as a teacher is a way for him to benefit people with his scientific knowledge outside of his time as Spider-Man. Plus, let's be real, Peter is more or less the embodiment of sacrificing your own peace to help others, and teachers do that all the time. Well, the good teachers do at least. Throughout this arc, we see a lot of Peter dealing with issues within the city, but also the looming threat of Morlun slowly growing in the background, as well as cutting back and forth between Peter and Ezekiel, contrasting them heavily, Ezekiel owning a massive company while Peter lives a more quaint life. We then see Straczynski showing off his characterization chops pretty much immediately. He shows this by making Spider-Man actually funny. Believe it or not, many writers struggle with his constant one-liners and banter during tight situations, yet JMS knows perfectly where to place it and where to pull back. I won't deny there were plenty of points where I chuckled at this book, which I think is what Spider-Man should do. Also want to add here, I think JMS has the right idea by making Spider-Man interact more and more with citizens than he usually does. A lot of other writers can just make these interactions be just people pointing and gawking at Spidey swinging throughout the city, yet here he takes the time to talk with people, show his human side, and show them he's here to help, which again is part of the webhead's appeal. Hopping over to the more experimental and controversial elements of some, I want to talk about the character of Ezekiel as well as the new elements of Spider-Man world that's being introduced. A more mystical side. He essentially ties Peter's powers all the way back to ancient spiders, spider gods, and other mystical or mythological ideas and entities. This makes us question something about Peter's origin. Was it all by chance? Or was it fate? Or a choice? On paper, this sounds pretty terrible, so I get why many people would find this to be not to their liking. However, I actually think it's well executed. When reading, you notice that JMS never gives us a direct or clear-cut answer to this. Instead, he allows us to either decide or ignore what we want to see. But he does make one thing clear. Peter is now going to have to learn more about himself and his spider side, or else. And what I mean by or else is that Morlun is coming onto the scene and he is causing havoc, coming to Peter with all of his power, and it's safe to say this is one of Peter's most powerful enemies, also adding and playing up the new mystical side of Peter's life. Morlun is essentially a vampire, and while here we don't really get a lot of information on what he is, We know that he needs to eat Peter's energy or soul to feed himself. Why? Because Peter's connected to the spider. That's why. Now, I know many criticize Moreland for being a flat character, but if I can add here, I don't think he's meant to be super complex at all. Instead, I think JMS was trying to make Moreland a more mega powerful magical force to make Peter have to learn about his spider side if he wants to or not. In a way, he's like a force of nature, a powerful, destructive thing you can't stop. But how you act in that inevitable storm is what will define you. And on that level, Moreland works well. Very well, in fact. Spidey's fight with Moreland gets really ugly. He's got Peter believing this will be his final fight, even calling Aunt May to take care of herself. He barely makes it out alive. I can't help but notice that Peter uses his knowledge of science to beat Moreland, who again is essentially a magic super vampire. Which lets the reader know this isn't just going to turn into Spider-Man becoming Doctor Strange or something, but rather, Peter has to use his skill and knowledge to fight new threats and adapt to changes coming to his life. Though with great change, sometimes comes pain. And also revelation. Hell, I gotta respect Straczynski in having the balls to let Spider-Man get his ass beat in his first story. But it works to set a new baseline, while also showing us that JMS is not playing around. He's going all in, and you're either down for the ride, or you might have to get off. I can't speak about this in my typical way, mostly because it does cover an incredibly dark event in recent history. Sure, we're still so far removed from it to the point where many have started to move on from the trauma, but I think this particular issue is an incredibly important one. In the wake of one of our worst tragedies in the US, Straczynski decided to step aside his story for a moment and use many of our superhero icons to show us not to give up. Not to antagonize or to attack those we might think are our enemies, but instead to lift each other up and support our fellow man, to ease each other's suffering. Maybe some will call this type of writing corny or crap for being political, and I hope maybe you start seeing the purpose in writing a story like this, and maybe mature a little, at least grow your understanding of the arts. While I wasn't even born around this time, in fact I'm only a few months younger than 9/11, I still feel the powerful emotion, but also pain coming from this book. I don't even think I could properly fully understand the true mind state this was made in. So instead, I'll just say that I deeply respect J. Michael Straczynski, John Romita Jr., and Marvel for being brave enough to even comment on what was happening at the time. Back to the usual story at hand, this arc is continuing a lot of the ideas introduced in the first one, while also adding new twists and turns. First, I love that Peter directly gets involved in a child's life because he notices them struggling, going out of his way to help a child in need, but also busting a small-time crook powered with magic. Here we get to see just how Spidey affects his community, doing the smaller thing to protect the little guys who would traditionally get ignored by the bigger heroes. This shows just how empathetic and caring Peter is as a person. This arc focuses a lot on Aunt May, and JMS does so much here to define her as a character. Like, no disrespect to any previous Spider-Man writers, but Aunt May was sort of the stereotypical frail old lady who faints character trope. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with that. In some stories it works, but I can't really think of any writer who's actually tried to develop Peter and May's relationship before this. And here, I think Straczynski does such incredible work with this revelation. We see May process everything that's happened like she's been struck by grief. And really, that's because she has been. Really think about it from her perspective. The boy she's raised since he was a child, essentially her surrogate son, has been lying to you for decades about what he does when he isn't around or randomly disappearing. You couldn't exactly nail what it was, and now that you do, how do you grapple with that? The media has painted Spider-Man as a menace for decades, and to some extent, you bought into it. I feel like this is the first major step in the story where JMS plays into what I consider the biggest theme of his era: the inevitability of struggle and change, and how you deal with that. We start to see that not just out of Peter, but May too, and it fascinates me how they both deal with it, especially May's reaction. Peter broke her trust, there's no way around it, that's just the truth. And with that new change in their dynamic, they both have to reconcile with it. JMS doesn't take the easy route and just have her forgive him. She accepts him, but also shows that it'll be hard to just instantly change her life around this fact. It's perfect character work, no notes. I feel like this moment of large change is well contrasted with Peter having to deal with certain things he can't change, despite the fact he has superhuman spider powers. The child he's helping is homeless, living in a makeshift homeless village of sorts in an abandoned building. He's faced with the reality that, while he could try to make this kid's life better, there's only so much he can do to pull them out of poverty. Which is why I love that he focuses on just trying to get the villain of this arc that's targeting the homeless and the girl they live around. The villain of this arc isn't too much to talk about, more or less a low-end crook who got his hands on some magic powers, though I enjoy that JMS still uses this to explore the more unknown nature of the mystical side Peter is trying to learn about. He's slowly bringing in more and more magical elements to get Peter out of his comfort zone, again, doubling down to the themes of change. We also have a slight issue that brings back Mary Jane in issue 39, and it's really good work because it shows how each of the three characters, MJ, Peter, and May, are all feeling during this period of time, and yet it's all told just through the art, no words, just visuals and atmosphere. And honestly, it's really good. Plus, it's nice to see MJ back for a change, she hasn't been around for a bit. Though continuing with this arc, we see May has to learn to support Peter, as well as Peter adapting to his new position as a teacher and superhero. We get to see Peter form a bond with a new secondary character, a police detective named William Lamont, who has a great dynamic with Spidey on investigations, but I think I'll talk about that a bit more later. Of course, we see yet another example of a Parker luck at the end here. Peter helping out hundreds of people, yet screwing himself out of talking to Mary Jane. Painful, but we'll soon see maybe something come from that. This little three-parter brings back a classic Spidey villain, Dr. Octopus, which I'll add here throughout JMS's run. He doesn't try to force classic villains to come back. I love a lot of Spidey's rogues gallery, but I also feel like so many writers try too hard to justify certain villains coming back instead of just attempting to make new characters, of which I think Straczynski does well here. Of course, this is a great story for Doc Ock. Mind you, this is before Dan Slott would do the whole Superior Spider-Man storyline, so here we have that classic Doc Ock, you know, arrogant, vengeful, and pettier than most of the people on Earth. And I'm all here for that. What is this story about though? Well, essentially a rich billionaire makes a new iteration of Doc Ock's cybernetic arms and tries to use them for his own selfish benefit, while also screwing Doc Ock out of a lot of things in the process. Which is why I called this arc OCTOPI, because there's more than one Dr. Octopus. Never mind. Anyways, of course with Peter's luck, he somehow gets involved in this whole arc situation more or less by accident. The only reason he's here is because he flew to Los Angeles with Aunt May to meet up with Mary Jane. Oh, forgot to mention, this story takes place in Los Angeles, so that double sucks for Peter since he's not on his home turf. The way JMS and Romita Jr. portray the action of this arc is so well done. The way they use the crumbling hotel as a set piece when the two Doc Ocks fight is just great. Plus, they do the whole Peter's gonna die under a ton of rubble trope. Not that I'm complaining, there's so many iconic Spider-Man stories that do this trope because, well, it's really compelling. They also use the film set as a fun set piece. I love the gag of the Lobster Man set they're on, MJ being a love interest in a movie just to be killed off and forgotten about, only to be used as a motivation for the superhero main character's story. I'm more than certain this is JMS being tongue-in-cheek about how a lot of Spider-Man writers sort of struggle to have MJ exist outside of being inside Peter's shadow. Not all of them, mind you, but the worst ones tend to push her to the side for Peter to take all the spotlight. Here though, we see an interesting yet awkward dynamic form between MJ and May. They both know Peter is Spider-Man, but neither of them knows if the other one does. It's kinda funny at first, but they soon also get over it and explain it. What works about this arc is JMS essentially forcing a major change in the story, mostly by forcing MJ out of the damsel in distress role she's given, making her her own person with goals and storylines that are equally as important and evolving as Peter's and May's, establishing a solid trio within our story, as well as providing a fun return of a fan-favorite villain. Probably to satiate some of the fans who can't go 3 minutes without seeing a classic Spidey villain in a comic, though he at least brought back Doc Ock in a new story that's kind of fun for his character. I'll say here that many of the JMS storylines will be split up as three-parters for a while, probably because that was just the best way for all these stories to be written without going on for too long, but also not being too short. I probably should also mention the fun new dynamic Peter has built up with Doctor Strange of all people. They have this sort of jokester and straight man dynamic, Strange obviously being the stern straight man and Spidey being the one who annoys him with his jokes. Strange acts as the webhead's magical guide, not as a mentor but more as the guy who comes in to set Peter straight about some of the magical oddities he'll soon encounter. In fact, this arc starts with Strange making Peter notice just how more mystical and strange some of his more recent encounters have been, making him aware that this isn't going to go away anytime soon, and is only going to become a new norm of sorts. This also plays off of what Ezekiel was telling Peter back in the first arc, about how there's some sort of universal pattern between him and his enemies, Peter being a spider, and many of his enemies being either animal or mystical themed. I mean, don't tell me you didn't notice it, right? Scorpion, the Rhino, Green Goblin, Mysterio, the Lizard. Yet Peter soon realizes that now he'll be targeted by his spider side's enemies, or in this case, predators. One of which he soon learns is the embodiment of the spider wasp, a hunter of the spider in the wild and in a cosmic sense. Of course, Strange, like Ezekiel, never gives Peter any definitive answers, never trying to point out if Peter is more magic or science. More so that this is just a fact of life now. To be honest, I feel like the villain introduced to this arc, Shatra, is much more of a better magical villain than Morlun is, at least compared to how he's used in his introduction. Shatra becomes an immediate threat, beating up Peter not just physically, but also endangering his reputation, even scaring MJ into believing that he might have cheated on her. Of course, this sends Peter into a blind rage, and that's exactly what she wants. She plays with Peter, toying with him. Morlun was more to the point and direct, whereas Shatra feels more methodical and challenges Peter in a way that's way more interesting, a much more clever opponent than the sort of lunk-headed Morlun. Though, I do wish we got a bit more time with her, and sorry to spoil the future, but we don't see this character in the future at all. But this story also presents to Peter, and us, a great story for all of us to understand the spider mystical side of Peter, as well as continuing the storyline with Ezekiel and Peter, which at this point seems like Ezekiel knows more than he's letting on and might not be the most trustworthy of people. This story starts with a beautiful moment of Peter going to LA after a trip to Africa, from the last arc. At the same time, MJ goes to New York. Funnily enough, they don't find each other there and wonder where the other is because they planned their trips at the same time. God, JMS is doing so well in making Peter and MJ one of the best couples in all the comics. Anyways, this leads to a cute moment where the pair finds both their flights meet up in the same Colorado airport and they meet each other, finally, and are able to just talk about how they feel. Of course, the Parker luck kicks into high gear again, and what seems to be happening here is the US government escorting Dr. Doom in custody. Personally, this story has already gotten bonus points for me because Dr. Doom's in it, and I like Dr. Doom. Peter just tries to ignore it, but lo and behold, a Latverian extremist comes out and tries to pull a bomb threat on Dr. Doom to kill him, and then sets off the bomb, creating hell for everyone involved. Because of course, this happens the moment MJ and Pete see each other again. Yet this sticks to being much more of a fun story focusing on character work and just getting Pete and MJ back together. I also love that Captain America gives some perfect advice in this arc, telling Peter, the mask is supposed to hide your face. Don't let it hide your heart. It's just beautiful, and while I may not be the biggest Captain America fan, mostly because some writers don't seem to understand how to make him not just a boring soldier character instead of the wizened war veteran hero with a heart of gold and wisdom for years that he is, but this is great. I think JMS understood that it's okay to have these characters have a moment to sit down and just talk about how they feel, addressing the fact that MJ does feel like she lives in his shadow, and Peter telling her that he doesn't think he can live without her. You see, Marvel, this is how you write a goddamn romance, you brain-dead, soft-skulled jackass.
I don't know what that was, I don't know what that was.
Up front, this story is probably my favorite new villain JMS has introduced, that being Digger. Now, Digger is the amalgamation of multiple 1950s New York mafiosos who were all killed, buried in the desert, and then revived with gamma radiation. Yeah, it's pretty crazy stuff. All of these dead men are fused together by the gamma radiation, essentially into a zombie mafia Hulk who walks all the way from Nevada into New York, just for revenge on the man who placed a hit on them. Let's keep it a buck. That's badass. We get tons of fun just watching the super zombie with an Italian wise guy voice causing panic in early 2000s New York. It's fun, but also a little sad and depressing. These people didn't want to be back, but now that they are, they're here to get their pound of flesh. This whole situation puts Peter into a bit of a predicament, Spider-Man now having to protect a man who's a known Mafia member, who's probably done, if not still doing, horrible things. But he has to because in his mind, it's just wrong to let him die off. It's really interesting how they push Spidey's morals back and forth, and at one point he's even accepting pay just to protect the guy because, well, he needs to keep his house afloat, the bills need to be paid, but he is also protecting a guy who's a known Mafia member who's probably placed hits on many people before. So you really have to kind of juggle your morals a bit here, and I think that's a great thing that JMS has added to this arc. This story is interspersed with Spidey and Lamont doing an investigation of this new zombie causing panic, with sprinklings of Peter and MJ in a sort of honeymoon phase, just loving each other and just wanting to be around one another. Really, this arc is a good time, but also making Peter realize that the fights are going to get worse and worse from here on out. It's almost like he's turning into a magnet for danger. Though, he always really was. Here's one of the few arcs that are only 2 issues. This story extrapolates on ideas from the second one. It focuses heavily on the effects Spider-Man has on his community, and specifically families within that community. In this particular story, Peter has to grapple with the fact that he harmed a family by sending someone to jail, specifically one of his students' families. Peter recognizes one of his students is struggling despite the fact he can tell they're incredibly intelligent. He knows it's something happening at home, and that's when he sees it. The girl's older brother was sent to jail by Spider-Man, leaving her single mother alone to carry the responsibility of all the bills. Plus, while her brother was released out of jail, he hasn't returned. That's where we see that exactly Ezekiel has set up a support group for ex-convicts, giving them well-paying jobs, teaching them on the college level, and generally helping them improve their lives. Ezekiel actually confronting Spider-Man, knowing that he's Peter obviously, about maybe considering how to improve things in the long term as well. And here we see that Ezekiel, while maybe a bit hard to read, is not exactly a terrible person. At least that's what it seems like. This is good stuff because it shows us Peter's solutions aren't always perfect, and it shows us the reality behind being a superhero or a vigilante. Things aren't always as simple as catching a bad guy and locking them up. Sometimes, people do things out of desperation, and people get hurt. First, allow me to explain something real quick about how sometimes comic issues can be numbered. You noticed how every issue so far has been labeled Amazing Spider-Man 1999? Well, sometimes comic companies will just decide to go back to a number 1 issue. In fact, it happens all the time. It can get a little annoying when numbering things, so to keep it simple, if you see a year next to a title before the issue number, that's the year that specific comic's first issue came out. Sometimes it'll also be separated into volumes, but that could get a little confusing real fast. Honestly, if you're a new-time reader, don't focus on what number an issue is whatsoever. It doesn't matter if it's number 1 or number 1000. Just ask someone you know if they're into comics, what's a good place to start, or just look online. From there, you can either just buy issues online, get an app, pirate them illegally, or just buy omnibuses online. Now, why does this arc end with Amazing Spider-Man 1963 issue 500? Well, they decided to go back to the original numbering from 1963, which would have made this the 500th issue of Amazing Spider-Man ever released.
Everybody got that?
This 3-issue story is, in a sense, a celebration of the long history of Spider-Man, or in other words, an anniversary special. It presents us with a massive magical threat, yet to be honest, this is just a side piece. More like wallpaper for what's going to be really going on here. This whole story is essentially Peter literally having to look back at his life, re-experiencing all his tragedies, his choices, his story, and potential future. He just looks back at it and it almost breaks him. We realize he's been through so much, many people would have broken down, but he didn't. He split between the end and the beginning, the place where his life changed forever and the last choice he made before death. Instead, he chooses, knowing it might turn bad, to fight. To fight through his past, his griefs, his everything, because he is who he is, and he'll do it all over again. And this story ends with Peter getting one more chance to talk to his Uncle Ben. Just one more time for his birthday. A genuinely beautiful story. These 2 issues are not really an arc, but more of just fun one-offs. Essentially an intermission after the heavy themes of the past few arcs, which are definitely needed after all that. Issue 501, which is titled Saturday in the Park with May, is just a goofy, fun little story of May doing her daily errands while Peter fights a new villain called the Shaker, who sits more in the Spider-Man villain circle closer to the Shocker and less like the Green Goblin, more or less being the villain archetype of villainy purely for money and self-gain and not too smart. The suit and vibration powers are cool though. Issue 502, Do You Want Pants With That, actually provides some great world building, introducing us to Leo Zielinski, a character who tailors and designs tons of costumes for all sorts of heroes and villains, providing us a fun little bit of world building, comedy, but also maybe some hints to the future? Another arc that leans into the new mystical ideas. However, instead of bringing in Doctor Strange, Spidey now has to team up with Loki, the god of mischief. Who's the foe they face? Oh, you know, only an ancient godlike sorceress possessing the body of a young woman who might end the world. Other than that, there isn't really much to say, mostly because nothing comes much from this story at all. It's just a nice little team-up two-parter with Spidey and Loki. This story ties up a lot of the loose ends and threats JMS has been introducing and weaving throughout the time on the series so far, paying off Ezekiel's shady past by finally giving us answers, explaining a bit more of the spider totem lore and more. Essentially, the embodiment of the spider has finally come to New York, and it comes to take what was taken from it without permission. Here we finally get a deep dive into Ezekiel's character, and we learn the one true thing that separates Peter from him. Ezekiel went out of his way to get the powers of the spider, forcing it to be given to him in a dark ritual, bastardizing its natural form, which then led to him living a selfish life, abusing his power only for his self-gain. The irony is, Peter never really wanted any of this power, yet grapples with the responsibility of it anyways. At first, he would have used his power for his own gain, but he learned better. That's when it all clicks. How we see that Ezekiel in many ways is truly selfish without knowing it. They were never after Peter, he's never had much magical experience in the first place. But Ezekiel, well, he committed the ritual to get the power in the first place. Many of those magical threats, be it the embodiment of the spider or Chantra or whatever they were not after him. They were after Ezekiel. He used him as bait because Peter is a genuine spider, who got his powers naturally. And now, Ezekiel is going to sacrifice Pete to the spider so he can keep his powers. Because while Ezekiel claims to use them for good, he's keeping on to them just to hoard them. He has his company, his world. He doesn't need the powers. There's a mystical moment where they experience flashes of each other's memories. And that's when Ezekiel finally sees the error of his ways. He stops the ritual and dies fighting the spider in the process, finally making the right choice. In the last moment of Ezekiel being wrapped up, a shaman comes and speaks about how Ezekiel wanted the power to change the world. He always had the power to do it. It didn't come from the spider or money, but himself. He kept getting in his own way, thinking that he was too busy to do the good he wanted to see. It all results back down to your choice, the moment you can choose. Because sometimes a moment to make change and not just talk about it is the moment some good can happen. This is a beautiful moment to end Ezekiel's story on, and truly understands one of the core themes of Spider-Man as a whole. And yet beyond that one speech the shaman gives, it doesn't feel the need to explain itself anymore, just allowing itself to be, and having Peter and the shaman going separate ways. If this era ended right here, I wouldn't mind. We'll still get good stuff later on, despite what some may say, but this makes a great full circle moment for the story. In many ways, this is an ending of sorts, since the series will take a different direction from here, either due to bigger events happening in the Marvel canon, or editorial demands, and just general changes to the story that happen naturally over time. But John Romita Jr. will also leave the book from this point on. He will be missed art-wise, since he is genuinely one of my favorite Spider-Man artists, if not comic artists, ever. But, well, I'm not going to spoil too much about this next arc, but it's going to be rough. Let me come out and just say this. I genuinely tried to give this story a fair shot. I really did, but man, what the hell do you want me to say about this story? This is one of the most infamous superhero comic stories of all time. No, I'm serious. I do mean of all time, not just Spider-Man. But to give JMS a lot of leeway here, the changes to the story were made because of heavy editorial changes and pressure. Apparently, he had a completely idea for the storyline, but the upper brass decided to change it completely. Part of me wishes he dropped it, but I also don't know what writing a series is like. Are you even able to just scrap a story once you've had a draft done? I don't really know, but I'm gonna assume not really if this is the case. This story is a prime example on how not to expand on prior events. Of course, this story is trying to extrapolate on the beloved death of Gwen Stacy storyline. The character writing isn't inherently terrible, though the plot is just not great down to the core idea. To be honest, the story feels cut from a similar cloth to the Clone Saga. To preface to the people who may not know, Spider-Man, well, that's not good. That's not good at all, dude. That's really, really bad. I mean, I don't even want to get into the moral implications of Norman Osborn having an affair with a young Gwen Stacy, who is far younger than him. He's like 40 and she's like 23 or something like that. It's weird. It's really weird. This arc has a new artist as well, Mike Deodato Jr. And look, no disrespect, I didn't really like his art at first. It's good, don't get me wrong, I just don't think it fits what JMS is going for. It's ultra realistic, and I don't really care for it right after John Romita Jr.'s art. It took me a while to adjust at first, but after a bit, I do learn to enjoy his strengths. Though I'd rather take Romita Jr.'s work and Ron Garney's work that's later in the series. Plus, I think he had a better showcase of his art style in other Marvel series at the time. I mean, his work on the Hulk and Thunderbolts comes to mind, and those are pretty good. But here, I just don't vibe with it. And no, I'm not just saying that because I really dislike this storyline. There's parts in the other stories too, I just really don't care for the art. Can we just move on from this, man? I'm hoping this will get better from here on out. This is a story that I sort of like. I don't hate it, I just don't think it fully accomplishes what it's trying to say or really do. Essentially, this story is about a character named Charlie Wiederman, basically showing us that there was a character when Peter was in high school that got bullied even worse than he did, which leads Charlie to have a bit more of an unstable personality, making shortcuts where he can and being a bit irresponsible with his science. This ends up with Charlie being covered in a vibranium skin suit and going a little power mad, ripping and tearing his way through the city and even going out of his way to murder some of his old high school bullies. We also get a lot of flashbacks drawn by Mike Wieringo. Not that I'm complaining, I like his art style a lot, and I think it fits JMS's ideas better, but all the past is in a more cartoonish art style, and the present Deodato's art style is hyper-realistic, and it's just jarring. I don't know if that was a great decision to make. Personally, I don't have much to say. I don't really think this arc has much to say, really. It's just kind of what if Peter knew Doc Ock, but in high school, because they're very similar arcs, but whatever. I'm not going to get too much into that. I don't know. I don't hate it. I think there's good stuff here, but I just felt like there could have been more to be dug with here. Something more interesting than just guy who was bullied worse than Peter turns out to be a bad person, because yeah, that happens to a lot of people with intense trauma that don't let it air out, but I don't know. Better than the last one. Hopefully we go up from here. Peter's moving up in the world. This was during that odd period of time where Spider-Man was part of the main Avengers team, along with Iron Man, Captain America, Luke Cage, Wolverine, and Spider-Woman. Man, the 2000s were a weird time for comics, but I kinda like that. I actually enjoy this arc though, focusing on how Peter, MJ, and May all react to moving into Avengers Tower, as well as pulling MJ and May deeper into the superhero world. Peter deals with an old school Hydra plot, which involves them making bootleg versions of the classic Avengers like Thor, Iron Man, Captain America, Hawkeye, and I think Hulk, but I could be misremembering. This is a major shift from what I've seen from previously, but I like it. It's some classic comic book goofiness, and I think we needed that after the downer the last two arcs have been. Though Peter has been off a bit for this arc, he's been a little loopy and even blacking out here and there. I don't know what it is, but that seems odd, like maybe they come back to that later. I also love that Aunt May becomes an immediately respected person in the Avengers Tower, basically taking over the building and also building a very cute relationship with Tony's butler Jarvis. Oh, yeah, Jarvis actually used to be a human being butler and not an AI. Kind of like Alfred to Batman. Honestly, this feels like a reset the book needed, bringing back a lot of the fun. Not that I'm against seriousness, but I feel like the way the last two stories handled their serious elements were just so draining. I really like this arc though, and I hope we get more stuff like this. This is the biggest story of the JMS run, being spread across 3 separate Spider-Man series. Now, I know back in my Booster Gold video I complained that leaving important plot elements or character development in other books that aren't specifically related, specifically event books, but here it doesn't really bother me much since every book here is obviously a Spider-Man book. That and each book involved literally has the fat "The Other" plastered on it with the subtitle Part 1 of 12 or something like that. So, at least they're making it obvious. This isn't completely JMS's story though. He actually collaborates with Peter David, co-creator of Spider-Man 2099. I just wanted to say that because I liked Spider-Man 2099. Though collaborating with Peter David is nowhere near a bad thing since he's a great writer. Deodato's style also doesn't purely dominate this arc, with Mike Wieringo working on the Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man series and Pat Lee on the Marvel Knight series. Now, I've already spoken about why I love Mike Wieringo's art style in my great Fantastic Four video. Go watch that. But I also like Pat Lee's style. I wouldn't rank it above John Romita Jr. or Wieringo, but he has an anime or manga-like style that can be pretty dynamic. though occasionally I think his faces can look a bit weird. As for the story, I really like it. In fact, this might be one of my favorite stories of the whole era. Remember when I mentioned the last arc that Peter was being kinda loopy and blacking out? Well, apparently that's because Peter is sick. His cells are degenerating almost like a cancer or something, and now he's got a ticking clock on his life. It doesn't help that he's been having strange dreams about Moreland of all people. It makes him act out, making him hide himself from MJ and May, and even lashing out at them every once in a while. But when he eventually breaks the news to them, everyone rallies around him. This affects May and MJ a lot. We actually learn about something in May's past, her having to pull the plug on her comatose mother. It deeply affected her, and they touch on it a lot throughout this arc. I'm thinking that this might be some sort of foreshadowing or something, but I don't know, my writer senses are just tingling, you know? This arc has two major villains. Moreland, who comes back to finally feed on Peter at his weakest point, and Tracer, a new science-themed villain, who I actually really like. Plus, it's very good they have a more sciencey, tech-based villain, contrasted with the more magical villain, to kinda edge out both sides of Spider-Man's reality. Tracer, though, is essentially a techie, opportunist, trickster bastard of a villain that makes bullets that follow their target no matter what. He's more than willing to target civilians to get what he wants, and I kinda like him. He's a classic scumbag villain that I kinda want to see more out of Spider-Man, and honestly, someone should bring him back. One moment I gotta highlight from Tracer is when he breaks into Avengers Tower and tricks Aunt May into thinking he's part of the team, then convincing her that he's a new god of machines. Bro, this guy is wild. He's got his head so far up his own ass he could see his uvula shaking around in there. I love that for a villain. It's almost painful to watch Peter just struggle to do as much as he can while he's basically dying. And eventually he actually does. Moreland finally showing up to beat Peter to near death, massacring him. Yet Peter has one more fight left in him to protect MJ from Moreland, and his spider side takes over and kills the vampire thing. I also like how they use Moreland as a sort of almost ghost-like ethereal entity of death. Like he's this ghost of doom coming to kill Peter in his weakest moment. It's an interesting way to expand on a character that was pretty one-note in their introduction. Though we soon learn that Peter wasn't dying, but instead experiencing a metamorphosis or a cocoon of sorts, coming out of a spiderweb cocoon a stronger, healthier man. But the spider in the afterlife, astral plane, it's not fully explained, tells Peter that he can't deny his spider side anymore, because it's saved him now. Which I kinda love this. I know they're not gonna kill Peter Parker, so instead they do it in a way that adds to the mystical side of Peter's life while also allowing us to meditate on life itself, forcing Peter throughout yet another major change. It's almost like that's a major theme or something. But yeah, I really like this arc, and seems like JMS and Peter David have really turned the series back into the right gear. I'll be real, I was kinda scared how this story would go, mainly because this arc ties into the Civil War event happening around the same time. And well, I remember that arc not going too well when I read it when I was a kid, so color me surprised that this story is handling it pretty well. Peter more or less getting pulled into a situation he isn't prepared for by Tony. JMS makes you understand why Tony is doing what he's doing, which I think the main books of the event don't do too well. You could see the logic and reason behind his actions, though you can also see that at a certain point, he's going to take it way too far. In this arc, we get quite a few iconic first-time reveals, but none more iconic than the Iron Spider suit. The good one, not the one from the MCU, that one's terrible. Also, we get a new artist from this story and onwards, and man, I love him. Ron Garney might honestly be one of the most underrated Spider-Man artists of all time, always finding ways to add great expressions, angles, and actions into his art. Though I think a lot of his best work comes in the arcs later on that he's doing, but this is also a great warm-up with a lot of good stuff. I'll be honest though, this arc's kinda hard to talk about on its own because it's meant to be set up for the next two stories to come. So, let's just talk about them. I've already spoken about how dangerous event comics can affect the mainline comics in my Booster Gold video. This is like the second time I mentioned that video in this one. What's going on there? But this story nails how to make it work. Instead, telling the story from how Peter sees it, making a compelling story while not taking away from the event book. If anything, this feels like each book would just give context to each other, but also each book on their own is a satisfying story. Here we see Peter struggling with the situation Tony basically forced him into. Peter revealing his identity to the public and being forced to fight for the Registration Act, even though he doesn't really agree with it at all. Nor does he agree with how Tony enforces the rules. Of course, he changes sides, airing out secrets to the world about the inhumane detainment practices of Iron Man's side of the conflict and picking the other side that Captain America's leading. While he's doing the right thing, he also endangers his whole family. And while he comes out victorious, good deeds have consequences. The story ending with an assassination attempt gone wrong and hitting Aunt May. One of the most traumatic and debatably iconic moments of the late 2000s Spider-Man era. This is easily the darkest storyline of the entire era, but it doesn't feel as draining as Sin's Past or Skin Deep. It's also one of my favorite storylines of the JMS run. I know, I'm not trying to glaze the later side too much. In fact, I do think the earlier half is great, but come on man, how can you hate Back in Black? Anyways, the darkness of this arc feels earned. It's like it's trying to test the faith and beliefs of all the characters involved. Aunt May's left in a coma, and this would inherently be bad because they could take her to the hospital, but Peter, MJ, and May are considered criminals now for taking Captain America's side in the Civil War. Thus, they can't just admit May to the hospital normally. Remember that foreshadowing from the previous arc, The Other, Aunt May talking about pulling the plug on her own mother? This is the payoff to that. Here we see Peter toss his friendly neighborhood morals aside, donning the black suit again, not the symbiote, just the black suit that was sewn from the thing. It's not the symbiote, that you get what I mean. And he goes on a warpath throughout all the criminal underworld in New York, fighting, beating, and interrogating anyone involved in the assassination attempt. Ron Garney's best work is in this arc. So many moody panels, expressions, and dynamic styles that he just plays around with. Plus, I think he has a ton of fun drawing the black suit, which is surprising because from what I've heard, artists hate drawing the black suit because it's just a lot of black ink, but what do I know? This is another arc that brings back a classic Spider-Man foe, the Kingpin, and this is him at his most evil. Not giving a single care, he just sought an elderly civilian, just wanting to send a message to Spider-Man if he can't kill him, especially since everyone knows his public identity now. In this arc, Peter has fully embraced his spider side, getting violent and acting like a hunter. I mean, this arc, it's just aura, and while I hate to say descriptions like that are too boiling down or too memeish, I don't know what else to describe it as, it just works here. And when Peter finally gets to the Kingpin, it's one of the most badass moments in all of Spider-Man comics. Easily one of the best stories of the JMS era. And sadly, it's the last. But I'll explain that soon. And here we are. The death I was talking about. The story where Marvel burnt everything down. I said earlier that Back in Black is basically the last JMS story, and that's because it is. Straczynski has gone on record saying he didn't want to be credited for the story at all, instead wanting to properly continue the thread set up in Back in Black. Yet Joe Quesada, who's a very controversial editor-in-chief, made this happen. In fact, I'm not even fully sure JMS wrote this book. I found it odd that Joe Quesada is the main artist in this book and Straczynski didn't want to write it at all. It makes me think that maybe he just said fuck it and Joe Quesada wrote it all himself. And look, the story is bad. It's a complete betrayal of readers' trust, backing out of every single element set up here, deleting and retcon literal decades of beloved stories and characters just because the book needed a heavy air quotes, fresh start. In a way, it's deeply ironic. JMS's stories were all about change, and yet, this era ends with someone wanting everything to go back to the way it was. Back to when things were quote-unquote simpler, making a literal deal with the devil. When it comes to Quesada's art, I just don't like it here. In fact, it's uncanny, but not in the cool X-Men way, but in the ew, this is kinda gross, what the hell am I looking at kind of way. One moment characters have realistic faces and proportions, the next minute they don't look like that at all. In a way, Quesada has done a great feat, somehow destroying literal decades of audience respect within 4 issues. So good job on that. Look, I don't want to sound like a classic nerd rage type of reviewer, but as a writer myself, this story has all the hallmarks of what not to do. People will tell you writing doesn't have rules. Well, for one, they're lying, and for 2, tell them to read this and come back to you. Hell, this whole Mephisto thing doesn't even make sense. Sure, Peter has gotten more into the mystical side of himself, but he should not be on Mephisto's radar. He's basically Marvel's equivalent to Satan himself. His motivation makes 0 sense here. Nobody's actions here do. There's no catharsis, there's no character growth, there's not anything. The story's vapid, it lacks any sort of artistic merit, it's not art, this is slop, content, feed. It's the type of crap that corporations want to feed you to remind you of that thing you like, let's not scare the audience now. They might think of something for once. They might feel something for once. And how are they gonna buy action figures of cereal if they feel something? Man, do you see the pain that this causes me? To have something that I grew attached to from childhood and adulthood, to let it in and feel something, just for it to stab me in the eye and say it doesn't matter? Well, I don't like to be blindsided, Joe Quesada. And to be honest, I hate that this is credited to JMS to begin with. Because clearly he gave a shit about telling a Spider-Man story. Genuinely cared. He wanted to grow the character, develop this, make a story for a new generation, but not this. This is the story that killed Spider-Man for a long time. It's been a long ride with this book. I mean, it was for JMS until he quit. He wrote this book for over half a decade, from 2001 to 2007. And what did I learn? What did I notice? Well, I noticed that JMS is a man with a vision. And while it might not be anything you predict or are used to seeing, he's a writer at heart, experimenting with all the elements of a character and taking strategic artistic risks to add layers to a story. And yet I honestly believe the worst parts of his run are when editorial gets involved. Notice how the worst stories from his run were forced onto him by editorial or changed heavily by editorial. He didn't want to do One More Day, and apparently he had a completely different idea for what he wanted to do for Sins Past. So, why do I call this the last great Spider-Man run? Because I think honestly this is the last run, in my opinion, that truly gets the character. Sure, he brings in so many new layers like Magic, Ezekiel, Moreland, all things that work great in the run itself, by the way. But under all that, it's still about Peter's life. I mean, he had Aunt May say it best. Life is the inevitability of hard times, which we only survive because of the joy in between. I'm paraphrasing here, but that's Spider-Man's ethos to a T. It's a surprisingly good run, and while it does end on the darker side in the end, most of that was not JMS's decision. JMS went into this run after a hellish period for the Spider-Man comics in the late 90s, and in a post-Clone Saga landscape, he went into this wanting to bring the characters back to their essence, but also examine just what exactly the essence of Spider-Man even is. That's why the Spider Totem magical stuff even works for me in the first place. Because I don't think it's meant to be taken super literally, but instead it's JMS trying to poke and prod at just what the purpose and core of Spider-Man really is. And for someone who's been a fan of the character since before I could even remember, I'd say he got it perfectly. It's just a shame because his time with the book for me and many other Spider-Man fans was a time of joy. But now we're in a long stretch of hard times before more joy. And yeah, that's all I really gotta say about that. As you can tell, I'm a pretty big Spider-Man fan, and I've actually wanted to make this video for a while since I really even started doing comic stuff. But hey, if there's any other comics you want me to review, either from DC, Marvel, Image, really whatever I could actually get my hands on, then hey, let me know in the comments below. And what's your favorite Spider-Man arc? I know I'm a big J. Michael Straczynski guy, but maybe you like Bendis, maybe you like Stan Lee, hell, maybe you even like some of the weirder stuff that other people brought in. But with all that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. And I'll see you next time.